Hello, I hope everyone's enjoying the trip to Florence so far. We've got a bit of a treat for you now. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a very dear friend of the Trollope Society, Teresa Ransom, who is biographer of Fanny Trollope. And Teresa is going to start us off with some observations about the life of Fanny Trollope and in particular, Fanny's connection with Florence. So Teresa, over to you.
Hi, I wish I could be with you. Actually, at the moment, everyone said we were going to Italy and to Florence. I thought that was one of the favourite places I went to with Fanny, about Fanny. It's there was something very peaceful about it. I don't know why, but I wanted to go because I knew she'd lived there. What I just have just made a few really rough notes here about why and when she went, because in December 1849, they all spent Christmas. She and the family all spent Christmas at Pau to recuperate because there'd been the death of Cecilia, the sickness of all Cecilia's children. Henry, Fanny's brother, had died, and the death of Theo's mother. So they really were a bit down. So they went there, and then they decided they would move on and they'd go to Florence, possibly to live. And Tom and Theo went on ahead, leaving Fanny in Pau, which she was not at all happy about. I mean, she knew she was going to be left there because she was writing a book, as always. She was writing Petticoat Government at that stage, or the end of Petticoat Government. And I think she found it difficult because she'd always been the one who made the rules. She decided where they were going to go, and the family went with her. And now here she was 70 odd, and her son got married, and he'd been her constant companion. And he and his new wife were going off to Florence to settle, to work it all out and find a house where they would all go to live. And I'm not quite sure whether Fanny was paying him rent or was paying him an allowance, but she was definitely paying him something to do it, because that was the arrangement, that Mr. Garrow would pay his share, Fanny would pay her share, and Thomas and Theo would pay the other third, so that they would then have, the idea was they would move into a house with 3 separate rooms, or 3 separate floors, I think it was, in as things were then. So each family, each area of the family would have their own little bit they could look after. And so off they went, and they found this place which was being built. It hadn't been finished, and it was on the corner of a place which actually then was called Piazza Mari Antonio. But about a little bit after that, it was later renamed, and I'm sure this was because of the fight for freedom in Italy, Piazza dell'Indipendenza. And that's now where the house still is, amazingly. And so what happened is Tom went off and he was going to design it, and he did. Fanny stayed in Pau feeling really miserable. She got mumps, then she got toothache, and then she really got more and more miserable until eventually she got on a boat from Marseille and got her way round to Italy. And Tom came and met her, and after that she recovered. All that bit of her letters is just sad, really sad. And you just felt like an elderly woman who was being left behind, or that's how she felt anyway. And anyway, so then when they finished it and enlarged it, Fanny had her own area, which I've not been able to find any description of, apart from the fact there were 2 rooms in which Tom and Theo lived while the rest of it was being built. But anyway, she felt very happy there. She had her own furniture. She got straight on and started writing another book, which she always did. I mean, like Anthony, I think she just almost started a new one before the old one was finished. And so that was good. And apparently then when they got to Florence, as I think you found when you tried to go last year, everyone leaves Florence in the summer because it's too hot and the drains aren't really very good. And so Fanny was really worried about this. So she and Mr. Garrow went on to Lucca, where they stayed, where they rented a flat and stayed, and really wanted Theo and Tom to come with them. But they wouldn't go. They refused to leave the house. They wanted to stay there. Tom wanted to be there for the building. So that was all right. But Fanny, so if this became a habit that every year Tom and Theo would stay in Florence in the house, and Fanny and Mr. Garrow would go off to Lucca, where there was, it sounds actually horrendous, there was a very established group of elderly English expatriates, immigrants, whatever you like to call them, who normally lived in Florence and decided to spend these years in Lucca. And they were very eccentric. There was a lady who, I've forgotten her name, but she had fluffy white hair, yellow hair, wore a very thin, diaphanous garment, was rather large, big blue eyes, and pretended to play the harp. She sat with a harp, like King David, apparently, and playing this harp, but not a sound come out of it. She didn't play anything at all. So I mean, it's worth reading about this. I wrote about it in my book, and I'm sure other people have found it. But they had a theatrical group and all sorts of people. So it sounds like sort of Butlins of the whatever it was, 1870s. But anyway, they obviously enjoyed it. And so, but when I came to look for this place, I tried to visit all the places where Fanny had lived, because I found it gave me a much better feeling of what had happened there and what it was like, and how big it was and so on. When I got to Florence, I loved it. I thought it was a beautiful city, very calm, very peaceful. I found the burial place. I couldn't find her coffin. I know you know where it is, so you'll be able to go and have a look at it. But she was buried near Elizabeth Barrett Browning, I gather, and various other people, and Theodosia, of course, who died 2 years after Fanny did. But when I went to find the actual house she lived in, I found the Piazza dell'Indipendenza, all right, and it's a beautiful little quiet little park with trees in it. And the day I went, it was sunny, and you just could feel this kind of serenity about it. And in the corner of this park, in the sort of top left-hand corner, so to speak, was this house on the corner, which I didn't know whether it was the house she'd lived in or not. So I knocked on the door, and and somebody came and opened the door for me. And of course, I don't speak Italian, which didn't help very much. And they didn't speak English. And I talked about Fanny Trollope. They hadn't got a clue what I was talking about. And eventually I saw there's a sort of plaque above the door saying that this used to be the house of Theodosia Trollope, who was one of the, not patriots, one of the, she was admired by the people in Florence, because Italy was very broken up at that time in different states, and she wanted to help to unite it. So I have a little booklet here, which I'll show you. This was why I first started writing the book about Fanny Trollope, because I found this book in a where are you? You're right way up, yes.
Yeah.
I found this little book in a trunk at home in my house in Australia in the attic, and it's called Villa Trollope, Florence. I didn't know what this was about, but I had some Trollope cousins, so I thought, who very, very vaguely related to the Trollopes. And inside it says this, if I can find it, it says, the world famous Villa Trollope was for many years the home of Mrs. Trollope, the well-known authoress. Her son, Thomas Adolphus, who built the villa, and of his wife, Theodosia Garrow Trollope, remembered for her interest in the writings on behalf of the Italian struggle for independence. The Sunday evenings at homes here were attended by the most illustrious and celebrated in literature, music, and art, visiting Florence from time to time. Mrs. Theodosia Garrow Trollope died here in April the 13th, 1865, and a grateful community placed a stone tablet over the entrance in her memory. After her death, her husband sold the property. And it had become, obviously, and he sold it. I don't know who he sold it to, but it must have been, this was written in 1909, in 1909, that's right. Yeah, that's right. There were hot water radiators in every room from October 1909. And it became a very well-known place for the English to visit when they went through Florence. This was the only bit of it I ever saw. I got into the front door, and that was the staircase inside. I don't know if you can see that all right.
Yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful
But
twisted column.
it really, but you can still see it. It was still there. That's how I knew it was actually the right place. Here is a picture of the billiard room, as it was.
Oh, it's like a room in a club.
It is. It was actually. Oh, of course, it's now. I don't think it's a hotel now. It's not where Fanny lived. This is the drawing room. This one,
Again, yeah, beautiful.
much more exciting. But it was a hotel now. And this is actually illustrated in one of the photographs of Fanny sitting on the covered terrace.
Mhm.
We've got pictures of this in various illustrations about Fanny and her life. And then the rest of these, nearly all, are of the garden, and apparently Tom was very keen on oranges, and he had a huge orchard at the back of this place. And it was very well known because there weren't many gardens in Florence then. But it suddenly makes you realize how empty it all was. If you could find a place that was this, it's quite big. If you could find a place this big and put a orange orchard into it and build a house with three families to live in, and you get the feeling that it was an exciting place to live because there were so many foreign visitors. I mean, particularly if you were English, because there were a lot of English writers and expatriates and people who'd gone for various reasons. Apparently, the book is boasting a bit because they want you to think what a wonderful place it is. And Mrs. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was an authoress. She'd stayed there. Frances Hodgson Burnett, Mrs. Frances Power Cobb, authoress. I won't go through the whole lot. There's a lot. George Eliot, Mrs. G.H. Lewis, novelist, wrote a part, if not the whole, of Romola in room 36. This would get you there. Kate Field, Margaret Fuller, I don't know her, Countess of Surrey, Charles Garvice, Thomas Hardy wrote Tess of the D'Urbervilles in room 60. But there's Mr. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote Transformation of the Fawn. Don't know who that is. It goes on and on. I mean, it's pages and pages of this. All these wonderful people who've been there. David Hume, Anna Jamison, don't know that. Walter Savage Landor, or George Henry Lewis, Robert Lord Lytton, poet, Countess Solo. It's not really interesting, is it? But Mary Somerville did, and Sir G.R. Sitwell, author, also stayed there. So it must have been a great place to stay in those days. And I just loved the feeling of it. I loved the feeling of Florence. And I thought what it did do, I'm not talking about Fanny very much. I'm just talking about Florence at the moment, but Fanny was such a fighter that wherever she went, she would have made herself comfortable. And from the misery of living in power with mumps and toothache and not enough money because the money was running out, and all the deaths in the family, she kind of picked herself up, dusted herself off, and took herself off to Florence and really enjoyed her life from then on in. So it was good. And I'm sure most of you will know by now that she had a very interesting life to the beginning of her life. She didn't really start off as a writer. She became a writer from sheer necessity because when she was in her 30s and 40s, she was in America in search of a new life and a new way of living and ran out of money and got sick. She was always doing this. She went somewhere, ran out of money, got sick, and then she decided she'd write a book of her travels, which is Domestic Manners, which is brilliant and still disliked by many Americans because it actually is quite rude and very truthful, if I might say so. Well, I say this quietly. I think it's very truthful, but it is a lovely book. And so she decided she'd have to write in order to make a living and support her family because her husband was not very good at that. So from the age of 50, which is not young to be starting writing, actually, she wrote Domestic Manners, which was a huge success. And then she just went on. She wrote book after book after book. And she loved writing about travels because it meant she could travel, but it also meant it wasn't going to make much money because they didn't sell terribly well. And she had all the expenses of traveling. So I think she decided to write novels instead. And they're worth reading. They really are. I have read every one of them, which was quite an effort. Some of them are not worth reading, but most of them are. And she makes very good, pertinent remarks about life and the way people should live, and criticisms of the way the world was at that time, the poor law, children working in the factories. Those are the ones she wrote very savage books about, as Dickens did. In fact, in many ways, she was quite like Dickens in the way she wrote. But and he thought she was great. But at that particular period, when you think of it, Dickens was a man, Fanny was just a woman. And so she was rather poo-pooed, and they thought her writing was a bit vulgar because she told the truth and because she didn't write just about flowers and cooking and things like that. She wrote about the poor law and people who needed help and marriages, women in marriage that were forced into, into servience almost. So, but it's worth reading her books. It really is, if you can get hold of them. So I don't know what else you would like me to talk about. I could ramble on for hours and hours and hours, but
Well, that's a great start and a great introduction. And we are reading a couple of Fanny's books for this trip.
Right.
Widow Barnaby
Right.
and Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw. So
Great.
I know that I have a good chat in the group about those. One of the things I was wondering about is, and I'm so pleased that Fanny then, after this, as your book is entitled, Remarkable Life, found a home and a place to be happy, because the struggles which led up to it were monumental.
Monumental.
I just was wondering about how all of this affected Anthony. So, his mother was very often absent, but was a great inspiration to him because we see him, following many of the traits which Fanny exhibited. But also in the letter, she's clearly very fond and loves Anthony. But it is a big thing to have left Anthony I think he was at Winchester when she went to America.
Yes, there was Tom. Tom was there too when she
Tom
went
was
to
at Winchester too.
Yes. I think I've always thought it was odd, and then I thought it wasn't, because her husband didn't really want her to go to America. I mean, for obvious reasons. If Fanny had gone on her own, he would have cut her off without a penny and kept the children. That's what happened then. The women had no rights of their own, absolutely none.
We're just reading he knew he was right, which is obviously exactly that story. Yeah.
Exactly that story. And she writes about this quite a lot, actually. And I think the reason she went was she could see that life was going to get worse and worse and worse. So that if you were in a marriage which was possibly an unkind marriage, I mean, he wasn't very kind to the boys. He would sort of pull their hair and hit them, which I think was what people did in those days anyway. It was, it wasn't a very kind society. I think Fanny needed company. She needed people, and she wasn't getting it. And when Tom, her husband, decided that he was going to move and go to a little tiny sort of rundown place miles from her friends,
Mm.
she decided she'd got to go. She'd got to do something. So she went to Paris, where she met Frances Wright, who I think was slightly mad. Actually, she really was, but very. She had great ideas, and Fanny could see that if she could get Henry there over to this new place that Frances Wright was in theory building in Neshoba, she might be able to make a life for Henry. She couldn't take the boys because there was no way Anthony, Tom, the father, was going to let all the family go with Fanny. She was allowed to take the girls. That was fine. I think she was allowed to take Henry because I don't think his father liked him very much. And he had dropped out of school and he was working in Paris rather miserably at the time. So and I think the fact that View went as well was a bit of an as an afterthought on somebody's point of view. I don't think there was any kind of relationship between View and Fanny except sheer friendship, to be honest. But I'm not sure that Anthony would have understood that, because I can understand he would have felt, of course, he would have felt abandoned, because he was left with Tom wasn't very nice to him anyway. Tom beat him.
Yeah. And I think that relationship, when Domestic Manners came out, was one of the issues that the Americans found, that it was hard to accept Fanny because she had this sort of unusual sort of family setup, I suppose. She wasn't she wasn't
at home knitting socks. She was a very independent woman. She'd gone off on her own, and she decided to make this bazaar, which, if you think of it today, was really a very modern thing to do, because it was going to be a place where you could have plays, books, reading, concerts, all sorts of stuff. And they didn't like that at all, because Cincinnati then was really a frontier town. It had only been in existence for 200 years. Well, I don't think even 200 years, come to think of it. And so you have to think of it as a frontier. Think of it the Wild West, which was a bit like, to be honest. Well, how do I know? But I gather that from reading about the time.
Yeah.
And so who was this woman who came in amongst them and told them what to do, and didn't like the way they behaved, and decided that they didn't have the right way of looking after their wives and people? And therefore, who was she coming in and building this garish, hideous, sort of mock, whatever it was, building in the middle of their town?
Yeah.
I
can see why it didn't go down too well. But
and I can see why Anthony wouldn't have understood that, because he wasn't there.
Yeah.
All he was a poor miserable child living at home with Dad, who was a bit nutty, I think. And also Tom was off by this time, wasn't he? I don't think, Tom left Winchester quite soon.
Yes, but he went to no, it was when Fanny. Yes, I think so. Yes. He did. So I think Fanny's inspirational. She's not afraid of any big project. The thought of building a bazaar in Cincinnati is extraordinary. And then off she goes and is building houses in Florence, and she has the house the beautiful house which is still there in Harrow. Yes. So she was a woman who was not afraid of a big project or making changes, and I'm sure we can all learn.
Impulsive, I would say, wouldn't you?
Yes, yeah.
She'd say, "Oh, I think I'll go and build a house near Cecilia." Right, off we go. Never thought about where it was or what it was like and what the people were like.
Yeah. So, indeed, I think as I said just before we started recording, the title of your biography, Fanny Trollope, A Remarkable Life, is a perfect title. It's a remarkable life and a remarkable woman. And thank you for joining us. We're going to have a discussion in the group, and no doubt many of the things that you've raised will be explored further. But thank you very much, Teresa. It's been lovely seeing you.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.